"Get those hands off the wall." The voice cut across the ballroom of the Belvedere Hotel like a dropped tray, and 400 people in evening dress turned to look. The man it was aimed at did not flinch. He was crouched by the donor wall, a soft gray cloth in one hand, wiping a smear of champagne off the brass plaque where the names of that year's platinum benefactors had been etched in serif capitals. He had a cleaning cart beside him, the kind with a yellow caddy of bottles and a mop handle that had been worn pale by years of grip. His name badge, pinned exactly where a name badge ought to be pinned, read Calloway, Faculties. Bertrand Ashford crossed the marble toward him the way a man crosses a room he believes he owns, which, that night, he very nearly did. His foundation had underwritten the new cardiac wing at Wexford General. His name was on the program 3 times. He was 61 years old, tall in the way that tall men learn to weaponize, and he had spent the cocktail hour being told he was generous by people who wanted things from him. "Are you deaf?" Ashford said. "I said get your hands off that. Do you know what that brass costs? Do you have the faintest idea what a single name on that wall represents? People like you don't touch things like this. You wipe the floors and you stay invisible. That's the arrangement. That's the whole arrangement." The man rose slowly, the cloth folded once over his thumb. He was somewhere past 55, broad through the shoulders in a way that had thinned but not vanished, his hair gone to iron and salt at the temples. His hands, when he lowered them, were a worker's hands, scarred across 2 knuckles, the nails clipped short, the skin dry from industrial soap. "There was a spill, sir," he said. "I was cleaning it before someone slipped. I don't care if the Pope spilled it. You don't put your dirty hands on that wall. Now here is the thing the 400 people in that ballroom did not know, the thing Bertrand Ashford could not have known, the thing that I am going to tell you now because somebody in that room should have. Those hands he was sneering at, those dry, scarred, ordinary hands, had once been insured for more money than Ashford's entire cleaning contract paid in a decade. Those hands had held the living, beating heart of a sitting Governor-General of Canada and steadied it and given it back. Those hands had been thanked in 2 languages by 2 premiers. There were surgeons practicing in this country at that very moment who had learned how to make a clean incision by watching films of those hands move. The man set down his cloth. He said, "Of course, sir," and reached for the handle of his cart, and that should have been the end of it. He had decided, somewhere around the word invisible, that he would simply leave. He would push his cart to the service corridor and let the marble dry on its own, and let the wall keep its dignity, since clearly the wall was the only one in the room entitled to any. Then a woman screamed near the head table, and everything changed. "But I'm getting ahead of myself, and you deserve the morning first. Because the morning is where you meet him. 12 hours before the spill, before the wall, before the scream, Solomon Calloway woke at 4:45 in a 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner on Danforth Avenue, and the first thing he did before his feet touched the cold floor was reach to the nightstand and lay 2 fingers flat against the glass of a photograph he no longer needed to see. He knew it the way you know the inside of your own mouth. A younger man in a borrowed tuxedo, grinning like a fool, his arm around a woman in a green dress who was laughing at something just outside the frame. Behind them, blurred, a banner that read Wexford General Foundation Gala 1996. That was the year Ruth told him she'd marry him if he promised to dance at least once at every party for the rest of his life, even the boring ones. He'd kept the promise for 24 years. He hadn't danced since. Ruth Calloway had been a cardiac nurse, and she had been his, and the cancer had taken her in a hurry. 11 weeks from the scan to the funeral, the kind of speed that doesn't give a man time to argue. That had been 4 years ago. He still bought 2 oranges at the corner store out of habit, because she ate one every morning, and he still gave the second one away, usually to the boy who slept in the doorway of the shuttered bakery 2 doors down, because throwing away an orange felt to him like a small, unforgivable thing. He made his coffee in a dented percolator. He ironed his facility's uniform on a towel laid over the kitchen table, both sleeves, the collar, the seam down each leg, until the polyester held a crease it had no business holding. "You can tell a lot about a man," Ruth used to say, "by whether he bothers with the parts nobody sees." Ashford, had he known that line, would not have understood it. That was rather the whole problem with Ashford. The commute was the Bloor line west, and then the streetcar, 40 minutes, and at the security desk of the Belvedere, a guard named Pavel said, "Morning, Mr. Calloway." The way he said it every shift, and Solomon said, "Morning, Pavel, how's the boy's cough?" And Pavel said better, "Thanks for asking." And that was 4 sentences, which on most days was 3 more than anyone else would offer him. He didn't mind. He'd learned a long time ago that the world hands its kindness out in small denominations, and you take what's offered without holding out for bills. His friend at the Belvedere, and I use the word friend deliberately, because Solomon Calloway had exactly one, was a younger man from facilities named Femi Bankole, 33, built like a fridge, raised in Lagos and Scarborough in roughly equal parts, with a laugh you could hear 2 floors down. Femi had taken it upon himself from his first week to wheel the heavy linen carts to the freight elevator so the older man wouldn't have to. Solomon had told him to stop. Femi had refused. That was the arrangement, as Ashford might have said, except this one was built out of respect instead of contempt, and so it held. Femi was also the only person at the Belvedere who knew. He'd found out by accident 2 years back. A delivery driver had gone down in the loading dock. A young guy, cardiac arrest, gray before he hit the ground, and the manager was screaming for someone to call 911, and the rest of the staff stood frozen in that way people freeze, and Solomon Calloway had crossed that loading dock in 4 steps, dropped to his knees, found the landmarks with 2 fingers, and run a resuscitation so calm and so exact that the paramedics, when they arrived, asked him which hospital he was with. He'd said, "I'm with facilities," and gone back to his cart, and the driver had lived. Femi had watched the whole thing. The next morning he asked the only question worth asking. "Who are you, man?" And Solomon had smiled the smile that answers nothing. "I'm the guy who keeps the floors dry, Femi, same as yesterday." What he didn't say, what he never said to anyone, was the rest of it. Here is the rest of it. Solomon Calloway was born in Africville, on the north edge of Halifax, in a house his grandfather built with his own hands before the city bulldozed the whole community and called it progress. He was the first in his family to finish high school, the first to see the inside of a university, the first to be told by a guidance counselor that boys like him became tradesmen, not doctors, and the first to ignore that counselor completely. He worked nights to pay for medical school. He chose cardiac surgery because it was the hardest thing he could find, and he had something to prove. And then somewhere along the way, the proving fell off him, and only the work remained. And he discovered he was not merely good at it. He was rare. By 40, he was the head of cardiothoracic surgery at Wexford General. By 45, he had operated on people whose names you would recognize, and several whose names were never released for security reasons. There is a photograph, somewhere in a federal archive, of Solomon Calloway in scrubs shaking hands with a governor general whose aortic valve he had replaced 8 days earlier. He kept a copy of it in a wooden case under his bed, along with 2 letters and a medal he never wore. And then a man died on his table who was not supposed to die. The patient was old money, the patriarch of one of those families whose foundation names you see on hospital walls, and the death was nobody's fault. Solomon knew it was nobody's fault. The man's tissue had been failing for a decade. The surgery was a long shot he'd begged Solomon to attempt. The heart simply gave out under repair, the way some hearts do. But the family needed someone to blame, because grief without a villain is unbearable, and the family had the kind of lawyers who could manufacture a villain out of thin air and a procedural footnote. They found one in the consent timeline, a form signed 11 minutes late by an exhausted resident. They built a case. And the hospital, which depended on that family's money the way a plant depends on light, looked at its brilliant black surgeon and its powerful white donors and made the arithmetic that institutions always make when they think no one is keeping score. They let him take it. His privileges were suspended pending review. The review became an inquiry. The inquiry, fed quietly by money, became a finding. They did not say the word race anywhere in the 400 pages. They did not have to. By the end of it, Solomon Calloway had surrendered his license rather than watch them drag the resident's career down with his, and the man who had signed off on the whole thing, the chair of the hospital foundation who had decided that one surgeon was a cheaper loss than one donor. Well, you've already met him. He was wiping champagne off a brass wall 4 years later and calling it filth. Ashford never knew the name of the surgeon he'd sacrificed. Why would he? To Ashford it had been a line item, a problem managed, a quiet Tuesday. He had never once looked at Solomon Calloway's face. He'd looked at a file. And that, if you want the truth of it, is the entire mechanism of how a man like Solomon ends up on his knees by a donor wall. Not one great cruelty, but 1,000 small refusals to look. Ruth got sick 8 months after the license was gone. He nursed her himself. When she died, he was a widower with no profession, no license, a savings account drained by a legal defense he'd lost on purpose, and a stack of certificates that meant nothing to a landlord. So he took the work that didn't ask questions. He pushed a cart. He kept the floors dry. He gave away oranges. And he told himself, on the good days, that a man's worth was not the same as a man's job. And on the bad days, he didn't tell himself anything at all. I want you to hold all of that in your mind now, because in about a minute, Margot Ashford is going to collapse. And I want you to understand exactly who is going to save her. The Gala was the Wexford Foundation's biggest night of the year, and Solomon had worked it for 3 years running without anyone noticing he'd once been on the other side of that donor wall, his own name etched in the brass back when he was the surgeon they bragged about. The plaque from those years had been quietly replaced. Institutions are good at that. The spill happened during the speeches. A server clipped a tray, a flute of champagne went over, and Solomon was nearest, so Solomon went to it before a woman in $400 heels could put her foot in it and go down on the marble. He was wiping the base of the donor wall when Ashford crossed the room and decided to make an example of him. You already heard what Ashford said. Filthy hands. Stay invisible. That's the arrangement. Solomon had folded his cloth and reached for his cart and decided to leave. And that is the precise moment Margot Ashford stood up from the head table to find her husband, pressed her hand to the center of her chest, said, "Bertrand, I don't," and folded to the floor like a coat slipping off a chair. What followed was the thing I told you about. The freezing. 400 people, and at least a dozen of them physicians, and for 3 full seconds nobody moved, because the human animal in a crisis waits for permission, waits for someone else to go first. Ashford dropped beside his wife, shouting her name, which is the least useful thing a person can do, and a cardiologist 2 tables over started toward her, and then hesitated, because he'd had 3 glasses of wine and knew it, and Margot Ashford's lips were going the color of slate. Solomon Calloway did not decide to cross the room. His body decided. 20 years of training does not leave a man because a committee takes his paper. He was at her side before he'd finished the thought, 2 fingers at her throat, his ear at her mouth. "She's arrested," he said in his voice. You would not have recognized it as the voice that had said, "Of course, sir," 90 seconds earlier. It had dropped into something flat and absolute, the voice of a man for whom this room had narrowed to one task. "Get back. Give her room, you," he pointed at the cardiologist without looking up. "Call it in. Tell them adult female, witnessed arrest, possible aortic event. You with the phone, find me an AED. The lobby has one by the coat check. Run. And somebody get this man off her." The somebody was Femi, who had appeared out of nowhere and who put one enormous, gentle hand on Bertrand Ashford's shoulder and moved him back the way you'd move a frightened child. Then Solomon Calloway laced his scarred, ordinary, filthy hands over Margot Ashford's sternum and began, and here, for a few seconds, it looked wrong. It looked, to a room of people who only knew CPR from television, like a cleaner doing something violent to a rich woman on a marble floor. Ashford was screaming, "Get him off her. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's a janitor. Somebody stop him." And a man at the next table actually reached to pull Solomon away. And for one suspended, terrible moment, it seemed the whole rescue might come apart on the ugliness of the room. Then Dr. Beatrice Lund pushed through the crowd. Lund was 71, retired chief of cardiac at Wexford, a small steel rod of a woman in a gray gown, and she had been sitting at table 9, and she had been watching the hands. She knew those hands. She had stood across an operating table from those hands for 9 years. She got one look at the rhythm of the compressions, the depth, the recoil, the metronome certainty of them, and her own breath caught, because there was only one person she had ever seen run a code with that exact economy, and she had been told he'd left medicine, left the city, possibly left the country. "Let him work," she said, and her voice did not rise, but it carried, the way certain voices do. "Everybody back up and let that man work. He is the finest cardiac surgeon this hospital ever had." The room did not understand, but it obeyed. Even Ashford went quiet, kneeling in his $5,000 tuxedo, staring at the back of a man he had called invisible. The AED arrived. Solomon charged it, placed the pads by feel, called the clear, delivered the shock, went back to compressions without a wasted motion. He did it again. On the second shock, Margot Ashford's chest heaved, and she dragged in a breath that was the loudest, most beautiful sound in that ballroom, and 100 people exhaled at once, and somewhere a glass finally harmlessly fell. Solomon kept his fingers at her pulse, counting, his eyes on her color, until the paramedics came through the doors at a run. He gave them the handoff in the clipped shorthand of a man who'd given 10,000 of them, witnessed arrest, 2 shocks, Rosesi on the second, query aortic, she needs a cath lab now. Not the closest one, the best one. And they took her, and only when the doors closed behind the stretcher did Solomon Calloway sit back on his heels on the marble and let his hands begin, finally, to shake. Beatrice Lund crouched down next to him, this tiny, fierce old woman in gray, and she did not say, "Are you all right?" And she did not say, "My God, Solomon, where have you been?" Though both were in her face. She put her hand over his still trembling one, and she said the only thing worth saying. "You never stopped being a surgeon. They only stopped letting you." And Solomon Calloway, who had not wept at his own dismissal, who had not wept at the inquiry, or the surrender of his license, who had wept exactly once in 4 years, and that was alone in a kitchen holding an orange. Solomon Calloway put his free hand over his eyes, and his shoulders shook once, and Femi knelt down on his other side and put an arm around him, still in his facilities uniform. The damp streak of Margot Ashford's spilled champagne still on his sleeve. I told you the gala didn't end the way Ashford planned it. Here is what it became. It did not become pity. Nobody in that room tilted their head at Solomon Calloway and made the soft, wounded face people make at the broken. They came to him with something better than that. They came with the particular awkward awe of people who have just watched someone do, with total mastery, a thing they themselves could not have done to save their own lives. A federal judge shook his hand and couldn't finish a sentence. A woman who ran a National Arts Foundation pressed a card into his palm and then laughed at herself, because what was Solomon going to do with a card? And she said her number aloud instead, and Femi typed it into his own phone, grinning, because Femi had decided in the last 10 minutes that he was now Solomon Calloway's social secretary and nobody was going to talk him out of it. A young woman pushed through to him last. She was 24, a second-year nursing student named Amara Quason, who had been working the gala as catering staff to pay her tuition, and she was crying in the way you cry when something rearranges you. "I almost dropped out last month," she said. "They told me I didn't belong in the program. I was going to quit on Friday." Solomon took both her hands in his scarred ones, and he said, "Don't you dare, 2 words." And Amara Quason pressed her lips together and nodded, and I'd wager every dollar I have that she did not quit on Friday or any Friday after. Bertrand Ashford left at 9:14, through a side door while the room's attention was elsewhere. His wife was alive because of a man he'd been screaming at 20 minutes before, and he could not find in the whole machinery of himself a single thing to say about that. He did not thank Solomon. He couldn't. To thank him would have required looking at him, and looking at him would have required understanding what he was, and understanding what he was would have meant understanding what he, Ashford, had done, not just tonight, but 4 years ago, to a file on a quiet Tuesday. So he left, and his driver pulled away from the Belvedere into the wet Toronto night, and Bertrand Ashford rode home alone, because his wife was in an ambulance, and the silence in that car had teeth. I'll tell you what happened to him, because you'll want to know. And because I think the universe occasionally does balance its books, even if it takes its time. By Sunday, a guest's phone video of the rescue was online. By Monday, it had 9 million views, and the part people shared most was not the shock, not the moment her chest heaved and she breathed. It was the 4 seconds before, when Beatrice Lund's voice cut through and said, "Let that man work. He is the finest cardiac surgeon this hospital ever had." And you can see, if you watch up closely, the exact instant the room changes its mind about the kneeling man in the gray uniform. 4 seconds of a room full of people being wrong, and then less wrong. 3 million shares of that. A journalist at one of the national papers pulled the thread. She found the old inquiry. She found the 11 minutes late consent form and the 400 pages that never said the word race and the donor whose money had been worth more than a surgeon's whole life. She found Beatrice Lund, who had been waiting 4 years for someone to ask. The story ran on a Wednesday under a headline that I won't repeat here because you can imagine it, and the College of Physicians and Surgeons, which had quietly accepted Solomon Calloway's surrender of license 4 years earlier, announced a formal review of the entire matter. which is the polite institutional way of saying we are going to fix this before it embarrasses us further. Within 2 months, his license was restored, with a written acknowledgement that the original process had been, in the college's careful language, materially compromised. Beatrice Lund called him personally to read it aloud over the phone. And when she got to the part about materially compromised, she stopped and said, "That's lawyer, for we should have stood up for you, and we didn't, Solomon. I should have stood up for you, and I didn't. I'm sorry." He told her she was standing up for him now. She told him that wasn't the same, and they both knew it. He told her it would have to do, because forgiveness is a thing you give the living so you can put down the weight, and he was tired of carrying it. Ashford's foundation lost 3 corporate partners in a week. His name came off the new cardiac wing quietly, the way his own name had once been etched onto a wall that someone else's name had been quietly removed from. And if you find that symmetrical, well, so did I. His public relations people drafted an apology, lawyer-approved, designed to slow the bleeding, and the internet was not interested, because an apology built by a committee never is. Margot Ashford recovered fully. She also, in the spring, filed for divorce, and she was photographed leaving the lawyer's office alone, and she did not look unhappy. She had seen her husband on the floor of that ballroom screaming at the man trying to save her, and you cannot unsee a thing like that about a person, not even a person you've slept beside for 30 years. Especially not then. But none of that is the part I most want to leave you with. The part I most want to leave you with is smaller, and it happened in a kitchen. Wexford General offered Solomon Calloway his old chair back. He turned it down. He told them, kindly, that he didn't want to operate on Governors General anymore. He'd done that. He wanted to do something else. What he wanted, it turned out, was a clinic, not a famous one. A storefront, really, on the east side, in a neighborhood where people went to emergency rooms too late because they couldn't take the day off, where a man with a bad heart kept mop floors because the alternative was not paying rent. He wanted to train people like Amara Quason, the ones who'd been told they didn't belong, and he wanted to find them young and tell them, before anybody else got to them, that the belonging was theirs to decide. He named it the Ruth Calloway Heart Center, after a cardiac nurse who used to say that the human heart was the only organ that did all its work in the dark and never once asked to be seen. The Arts Foundation woman whose card was useless to no one funded the first year. Beatrice Lund came out of retirement to run the clinical side, on the condition that Solomon let her boss him around, which he agreed was a fair trade. Femi quit the Belvedere and came to run the building, because somebody had to keep the floors dry, and Femi said he'd be damned if he'd let anyone else do it. And there was a young nurse on the staff list, in the second year, whose surname was also Calloway, Naomi, his daughter, who had stopped speaking to him during the worst of the inquiry because she'd believed, for a while, the version of him that the 400 pages had built. She'd seen the video like everyone else. She'd called him the next morning. The first thing she said was Dad, and the first thing he said was, "I kept the second orange for you, baby, every morning, in case you ever came home," and that was a conversation that took 4 years and lasted 6 hours, and I am not going to put any more of it here because some doors you let a man close behind himself. The morning after the clinic's license came through, Solomon Calloway woke at 4:45 out of habit, in the same apartment above the same dry cleaner, because he had not yet got around to moving and was in no hurry to. He laid 2 fingers on the glass of the photograph. The radiator ticked. He made his coffee in the dented percolator. And then he did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He knelt down, pulled the wooden case from under the bed, and opened it. The 2 letters. The medal he'd never worn. The archived photograph of a younger man in scrubs shaking hands with a governor general. He touched them the way he touched Ruth's photo every morning. Not to read them, just to know they were real. Just to know that the man in them had been real, that he hadn't dreamed the whole life before the wall and the cart and the long gray patience of being invisible. He sat at his kitchen table with his cold coffee, and the building breathed around him. Pipes, a neighbor's footsteps, the streetcar rolling its first run down the Danforth. And for the first time in a very long time, Solomon Calloway smiled. Not for a room, not for a camera, not to prove a single thing to a single soul. He looked at the empty chair across the table, where for 24 years a woman in a green dress had eaten 1 orange every morning of her life, and he said very quietly, so that only the kitchen could hear it, "You always said these hands were made for more, Ruthie. Took me a while. but I kept them clean. The world did not hear that sentence. The world had got everything else. The video, the headline, the license, the clinic, the books finally balancing. But that one sentence wasn't for the world. It was for one person, and she wasn't in the room anymore. And he said it anyway, because that's what love is in the end. It isn't a thing you do for an audience. It's a thing you keep doing in the dark, where nobody's watching, asking only that you not stop.